The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary and stew as the autumn wind tapped softly against the windows. Lucille Hayes, 70 years old and long retired from her job as an elementary school teacher, moved slowly from counter to stove, humming a tune she used to sing to her son when he was small. Cooking had always been her way of showing love, and though Henry rarely thanked her anymore, she still prepared his favorite meals, out of habit, out of memory, out of hope that some part of the boy she raised still lived inside the man he had become. The sound of the front door closing broke her thoughts. Henry walked in without looking at her, scrolling through his phone as if she were just part of the furniture. "From now on," he said flatly, still not meeting her eyes, "the bank will transfer your retirement money directly to my account. You don't need money, Mom. Just a place to die." The spoon slipped from Lucille's hand and clattered against the tile. The sharp ring of metal echoed through the small kitchen like a gunshot. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The words had jammed somewhere deep in her chest, too heavy to rise. Henry didn't seem to notice. He kept tapping the screen, his face lit by the glow of his phone, as if he hadn't just erased his own mother with a single sentence. Lucille swallowed hard and bent to pick up the spoon. The stew bubbled gently on the stove, but the comforting scent she had always loved now turned her stomach. The walls of the house, her house, seemed suddenly foreign, like a stranger's home she had wandered into by mistake. She finished the meal in silence. At dinner, Henry ate without a word. Veronica, his wife, chattered about weekend plans, laughing at something on her phone. Not once did either of them look at Lucille. Later, when the clock crept past 11 and the house fell into darkness, Lucille sat alone at the dining table. The silence pressed against her chest heavier than any of her 70 years. From down the hall came the sound of Veronica's laughter, bright, carefree, and cruel. That woman, Lucille thought, had done what neither poverty nor widowhood could do: strip her son of every trace of compassion. Since the day Veronica appeared, everything had changed. Lucille still remembered their first meeting vividly. Veronica had been young, beautiful, and impeccably polite, her words honey-sweet, but too polished to be real. "Your son has such a kind heart, Mrs. Hayes," she had said over coffee, smiling that perfect, rehearsed smile. Lucille had believed her. She had believed many things back then. Now, years later, she could see the truth hiding behind that smile. The pride, the calculation, the quiet disdain. It had started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Henry calling less, listening less, dismissing her opinions. Then came the marriage, and with it, the distance. He no longer asked about her day. He no longer sat at the table just to talk. And now, tonight, he had taken the final step, stripping her of her dignity with a sentence spoken without even looking up. Lucille stared into the darkness, her hands resting quietly in her lap. The house felt colder than it ever had before. Once it had been a refuge, filled with laughter and warmth. Tonight it felt like a prison. She closed her eyes and listened to the faint echo of Veronica's laughter through the walls, remembering the boy Henry used to be. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who no longer saw her as his mother. And in the hollow silence of that autumn night, Lucille realized something even colder. She was no longer part of her son's world. The night dragged on without mercy. Lucille didn't sleep. She sat by the kitchen window long after the house had gone quiet, the cold moonlight painting thin lines across the floor. Somewhere between one breath and the next, her mind slipped backward through the years, to a time when this same house had been filled with laughter and dreams instead of silence. She had been just 22 when she married Samuel Hayes, a man with calloused hands, a quick smile, and a heart steady as the earth. They had nothing back then: one rented room, a second-hand radio that crackled more than it played, and each other. Yet life felt full. When Henry was born, Samuel wept as he held their son, tears falling onto the newborn skin like promises. He swore to protect them, to love them, to build a future with his bare hands. And for a while he did. But life had other plans. Samuel died young, too young, in an accident on a construction site. Lucille was 36. Henry was just 10. That day split her life cleanly in two. The before, scented with fresh bread and Sunday picnics, and the after, heavy with overdue bills and nights of quiet sobbing into her pillow. She took on everything she could to survive. Mornings in the classroom, teaching children their letters. Afternoons, sewing clothes for neighbors. Evenings, tutoring to earn a few more dollars. There were winters when she skipped meals so Henry could have milk. Nights when she patched her worn shoes instead of buying new ones. Once, when the soles finally gave out, she walked barefoot to the school gate, slipping them back on before anyone could see. Henry had seen. He'd hugged her so tightly she thought he'd never let go. Those were the moments that kept her going. "Someday I'll buy you a house with a garden, Mom," he used to say, "so you don't have to live with all the noise." And she had believed him. Every sacrifice felt worth it because she believed. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Maybe it was his first paycheck, or the way Veronica's polished world made him ashamed of the life they'd shared. He stopped seeking her advice. He stopped telling her things. The warmth in his eyes turned into impatience, then into something colder, disdain. The first time it truly broke her was on his wedding day. Veronica looked radiant, and Lucille told herself she was happy for them. But when the priest asked Henry to thank his parents, he turned only to Veronica's mother. Not a word for Lucille, not even a glance. At the reception, they placed her at a table near the back, far from the laughter and the speeches. As they left, Veronica hugged her politely, leaned close, and whispered, "You've done enough." It was meant as kindness, perhaps, but it landed like a verdict. From that day forward, Lucille wasn't a mother or a guide. She was background noise, a piece of old furniture that took up space. And now, decades of sacrifice sat heavy on her chest as she stared into the pale light of morning, wondering if 40 years of love had all been for nothing. The night after Henry's words had cut her to the bone, Lucille moved through the house like a ghost. Every sound seemed sharper. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock counting down the seconds of a life that no longer felt like hers. But beneath the ache in her chest, something else had begun to stir, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was resolve. In the quiet hours after midnight, Lucille walked to the small wooden cabinet in her bedroom. Behind stacks of folded linens and an old lace tablecloth lay a tin box she hadn't touched in decades. Inside were fragments of a life long lived. Letters from Samuel, faded photographs, coins collected from field trips with her students. And tucked beneath it all, yellowed but unmistakable, were copies of bank documents Henry had forged, papers he'd used to try and seize control of her retirement account. He must have left them on the kitchen table days ago, assuming she wouldn't notice or understand. But she had. Lucille traced her wrinkled fingers over the ink of her signature, forged with a carelessness that spoke volumes. She held those papers for a long moment, then looked toward the refrigerator humming softly in the corner. An idea, simple, dangerous, and quietly brilliant, began to take shape. She filled a shallow dish with water, slipped the papers inside a sealed bag, and placed it in the freezer. By morning, they were locked inside a solid block of ice. On top, she laid a small piece of paper with a single line written in steady, deliberate script. Never underestimate a mother, not even an old one. The following morning dawned cold and gray. Lucille sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as if it were any other day. When Henry walked in, he didn't greet her. He went straight to the refrigerator, yanked open the door, and froze. There, sitting on the middle shelf, the incriminating documents floated in crystal-clear ice, her forged signature glaring up at him like an accusation. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then came the crash of glass hitting tile, followed by a shout that made the walls tremble. Veronica appeared in the doorway, startled, asking what was wrong. Henry couldn't speak. He simply pointed, his hand shaking, his face pale. Lucille rose slowly, her movements unhurried, and met his eyes with a calm he'd never seen before. "Good morning, Henry," she said softly. "Would you like some coffee?" And for the first time in years, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The balance had shifted, and he knew it. The fallout from the refrigerator incident was swift. Within days, Henry and Veronica tightened their grip on Lucille's life as if trying to crush any trace of rebellion before it could grow. The house, once a place of warmth and familiarity, turned into something closer to a cage. They took her house keys first, claiming they were worried she might wander off and get lost. Next, they began hovering near the front door whenever she approached it, insisting on accompanying her even to the mailbox. They stopped letting her go to the grocery store alone, citing her age as the reason. And when she protested, Henry gave her a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, we're just trying to protect you," he said. "It's for your own good." Veronica was worse. She started speaking to Lucille in the slow, exaggerated tone one might use with a confused child. She labeled kitchen cabinets as if Lucille had forgotten where the dishes were. She questioned whether Lucille had taken her medication she didn't even need. The humiliation was deliberate, and it worked its way under Lucille's skin like splinters. But she never raised her voice, never fought back. Outwardly, she appeared beaten, a frail, aging woman too tired to resist. Inwardly, she was watching, waiting, learning. One afternoon, as she swept the porch steps under Veronica's watchful gaze, a familiar figure from next door appeared. Martha Campbell, her neighbor of nearly 4 decades. Martha had seen the changes in the Hayes household and suspected more than Lucille had ever told her. That day, Martha lingered as they chatted about the weather, and when Veronica's attention shifted back inside, she slipped a small flip phone into Lucille's hand. "Just in case," Martha whispered. "You're not alone." That night, under the dim glow of her bedside lamp, Lucille powered on the phone with trembling fingers. She scrolled through the meager contact list and found one name Martha had already entered: Raymond Cole. Raymond had been Samuel's closest friend and once served as a director at a local community bank. Lucille hesitated before calling. It had been years, but when she heard his steady voice on the line, the weight on her chest eased. She told him everything: the forged documents, the frozen evidence, the way Henry and Veronica were trying to isolate her. Raymond listened without interruption, then spoke calmly. "We'll fix this," he said, "but you need to play the part. Let them believe they've broken you." And so she did. In the days that followed, Lucille leaned into the image they wanted to see: frail, docile, harmless. She let Veronica guide her by the elbow, let Henry make decisions on her behalf, even let them believe she had forgotten where she'd hidden the papers. But beneath the quiet compliance, her resolve hardened like steel. Every condescending smile, every patronizing word only sharpened her determination. They thought they had stripped her of power. What they didn't realize was that Lucille Hayes was no longer playing defense. She was planning her next move. By the 3rd week of her captivity, the routines of control had become predictable. Veronica hovered near the kitchen every morning, offering unsolicited help with breakfast. Henry checked her pill bottles, counted the cash in her purse, even commented on how many minutes she spent on the porch. They believed they had reduced Lucille to a powerless old woman clinging to memory and routine. But behind her calm eyes, the gears were turning. One evening, as autumn rain drummed softly against the windows, Lucille lingered in the hallway outside Henry's study. The door was cracked open, and their voices floated into the dim corridor. "The realtor says the market's perfect," Veronica whispered, her tone sharp and eager. "If we list the house this month, we could get more than $400,000. But we need her signature to finalize the sale." Henry sighed. "She'll sign. She's too tired to fight anymore. I'll tell her it's for her medical care or some nonsense. She'll believe it." Lucille pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself. So this was their plan, not just to control her, but to erase her entirely, selling the home Samuel had built with his hands, the place where every memory of their life together lived. For a moment, grief washed over her. Then it cooled into something sharper. In the darkness of that narrow hallway, Lucille smiled, not with joy, but with quiet, dangerous certainty. That night, she called Raymond again. Her voice was steady as she explained what she had heard. Raymond didn't hesitate. "We'll change everything," he said. Together, they drafted new documents that placed every asset, the house, her savings, even her modest pension, fully under her legal control. More importantly, Raymond added a clause Lucille insisted on. Upon her death, the house would not go to Henry, but to a charitable trust dedicated to housing elderly women abandoned by their families. It was poetic, almost biblical. A house once used to cage her would one day free others. A few days later, Veronica appeared at her bedroom door carrying a breakfast tray. "I made this just for you," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The oatmeal was flecked with something unfamiliar, and the tea had a faint, bitter scent Lucille didn't recognize. Her stomach turned. She thanked Veronica and waited until the door closed. Then, carefully, she emptied the meal into the trash and flushed the tea down the toilet. They thought they were clever, that her age made her blind, that her love made her weak. But Lucille Hayes was no longer the woman who cried alone at her kitchen table. She was planning, protecting, reclaiming. And as the rain tapped against the glass, she realized something vital. They weren't the hunters anymore. She was. A week later, the trap they had been weaving finally tightened, or so Henry and Veronica believed. That morning, they entered Lucille's room with an air of forced gentleness, carrying a thick stack of papers clipped neatly together. Veronica's smile was too wide, her tone too sweet. "We've been talking, Mom," she said, setting the documents on the table by Lucille's chair. "We think it's best to simplify things. This way, everything is organized for your care, and you won't have to worry about bills or property or anything." Henry, standing behind her, added, "It's just a few signatures. Routine stuff. You trust us, don't you?" Lucille adjusted her glasses and looked at the papers. They were exactly what she expected. A transfer of property deed, a change of account ownership, a durable power of attorney, all carefully prepared to strip her of every last ounce of control. Her name was typed cleanly on each line, awaiting her trembling signature. For a long moment, she let silence stretch between them. Then she sighed softly and nodded. "If it makes things easier for you," she murmured, "I suppose I can sign." She took the pen in hands that shook just enough to be convincing and scrawled her name where they pointed. Each signature felt like a knife twisting deeper, but she didn't flinch. She even thanked them afterward, her voice weak and resigned. Henry looked relieved. Veronica practically glowed. "See, that wasn't so hard," she said, kissing Lucille's cheek before they left. "We'll take care of everything from now on." That evening, the house was unusually quiet. Henry and Veronica had gone out to celebrate. Dinner and champagne, Lucille imagined, to toast the victory they believed they had won. In their absence, she walked to the small cabinet in her bedroom and retrieved a different set of documents. The ones Raymond had prepared, notarized, and filed with the county clerk days earlier. Those papers made everything Henry and Veronica had done meaningless. The house, the savings, every cent and brick and board were already secured under Lucille's name, bound by legal protections they couldn't undo. And the clause that transferred the property to a charitable trust upon her death? It was ironclad. The next morning, Lucille sat calmly at the kitchen table as Henry answered a call from the bank. She watched the color drain from his face as the voice on the other end explained that the transfer documents he submitted were invalid and that his access to her accounts had been suspended pending investigation. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "I have power of attorney." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," the banker replied, "but that's no longer the case." Henry ended the call with shaking hands. Veronica's voice rose in panic, demanding answers. But Lucille only stirred her tea and gazed out the window at the turning leaves, the faintest trace of satisfaction on her lips. They had built a castle out of forged signatures and arrogance, and it had crumbled overnight. Their victory dinner had been premature. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed were filled with tension, so sharp it seemed to slice through the walls of the house. Henry spent hours on the phone, his voice rising and breaking as he argued with bankers, lawyers, anyone who would listen. But there was no mistake, no loophole to exploit. His access to Lucille's accounts was frozen. The bank had flagged multiple suspicious transactions and forwarded the case to their fraud department. What Henry had dismissed as a simple paperwork misunderstanding was now an active investigation. The morning the official notice arrived, Henry lost control. He paced the living room like a caged animal, waving the letter in his fist. "This is your fault," he hissed at Veronica. "You said this would work. You said she wouldn't fight back." Veronica crossed her arms, her voice dripping with disdain. "Don't you dare put this on me, Henry. You're the one who signed everything. You're the one who pushed this too far." "Too far?" he roared, stepping toward her. "I did this for us, for our future. And now look at us, broke, under investigation, and probably going to jail because of your bright ideas." The fight escalated quickly. Words turned into shouts, shouts into accusations. And then, in one furious motion, Henry shoved her. Veronica stumbled backward, crashing into a side table before hitting the floor with a cry. The room fell silent except for her ragged breaths. Lucille, standing in the doorway, watched it all unfold with an eerie calm. "Do you see him now, Veronica?" she said quietly. "That's the man you built. Angry, selfish, and cruel." Henry spun toward her, his face flushed with rage. "You did this. You poisoned everything." But Lucille didn't flinch. "No, Henry, you did, and you weren't alone." She stepped closer, her voice steady and cold. "You want to know what the bank will find when they look deeper? That the first forged signature wasn't yours. It was Veronica's. And that she was the one who suggested taking my pension in the first place." Veronica's eyes widened in horror. "That's a lie!" she shouted, scrambling to her feet. But Henry had gone very still. The fury drained from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. "You started this," he whispered. "You ruined everything." "Henry, stop!" she pleaded, backing away. But he was already reaching for the phone, muttering about lawyers and deals and how maybe he could still save himself. In a panic, Veronica bolted down the hall and locked herself in the guest room. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house like a final verdict. When the police arrived that afternoon, there was no dramatic struggle. 2 officers read Henry his rights, while another knocked gently on Veronica's door. She emerged pale and trembling, her hand shaking as they cuffed her beside her husband. Fraud, forgery, attempted theft of assets from a vulnerable adult. The charges were heavy and both knew it. As the patrol car pulled away, silence settled over the house, a silence deeper than any Lucille had ever known. She walked into the kitchen and opened the freezer. Inside, the block of ice that had once held Henry's forged documents was melting into a shallow pool of water. She carried it to the table and watched as it dripped slowly onto the wood. It felt symbolic, as if the lies and betrayals that had defined the last few years were finally dissolving into nothing. The house was hers again, not just the bricks and mortar, but the space itself, the quiet, the light, the air. Lucille pressed her palm flat against the table and closed her eyes. The war was over. The enemy had been vanquished not by force, but by patience, by truth, and by a mother's unyielding will. 3 weeks after the police cars vanished down the street, the house on Maplewood Lane felt like itself again. For the first time in years, Lucille threw open every window and let the autumn light flood in. The air smelled of jasmine once more, the same scent Samuel had planted by the kitchen door decades earlier. She brewed tea in silence, watered the potted herbs on the windowsill, and hummed old songs without fear of someone telling her to be quiet. The rooms no longer echoed with slammed doors or sharp words. There was no Veronica hovering behind her shoulder, no Henry barking orders or checking her every move. There was just peace, delicate, precious peace, and Lucille cherished it like oxygen. Each day, she rebuilt the small rhythms of her life. Morning walks to the bakery, afternoons reading on the porch, evenings spent writing letters to former students who still called her Mrs. Hayes. But peace, she realized, did not mean forgetting. The hurt Henry had caused lived inside her like an old scar, not raw, but impossible to ignore. Even so, she found herself thinking of him often. Of the boy who once held her hand on walks to the library, who used to leave her crayon drawings with notes that read, "For the best, Mom." Somewhere along the line, that boy had been buried beneath resentment and greed. 6 months later, on a gray February afternoon, a knock came at the door. Lucille opened it to find Henry standing on the porch. Prison had changed him. He looked older, smaller somehow, as if the weight of his choices had carved pieces out of him. His hands twisted nervously in front of him, and his eyes, once defiant, were full of shame. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Lucille didn't speak. She simply watched him, letting the silence stretch between them. "I lost everything," Henry continued, voice trembling. "The house, the money, the future I thought I wanted. But the worst thing I lost was you. I didn't just betray my mother, I betrayed the woman who sacrificed everything for me." Her heart ached at his words, but she held her ground. "A son can lose everything," she said quietly. "He can lose money, a home, even his freedom. But when he loses his mother's respect, there's no path back to what once was." Henry nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I just wanted you to know I understand now." They stood in silence for a long moment before he turned and walked down the path. Lucille didn't try to stop him. When she closed the door, she noticed a small envelope on the porch bench. Inside was a faded photograph of Henry as a boy, sitting on her lap with a smile too big for his face. On the back, written in his uneven handwriting, were the words, "You were always stronger than I thought." Lucille traced the words with her fingertip, a bittersweet smile ghosting her lips. Forgiveness was still far away, but the silence that followed his visit felt different, not heavy, not painful. It was the kind of silence that spoke for itself. 6 months after Henry's visit, the house on Maplewood Lane no longer felt like the stage of a family tragedy. It felt alive again, different, yes, but alive. Lucille had spent those months thinking about everything that had happened, about the years she had lost and the pain she had endured. But more than anything, she thought about the countless women like her, mothers who had given everything, only to be discarded when they were no longer useful. The thought gnawed at her until it became something else, a calling. One morning in late summer, Lucille placed a handwritten sign on the white picket fence out front. It read, "The House of the Brave, a place for women to begin again." What started as an idea soon became a refuge. A retired nurse named Evelyn was the first to arrive, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the story of children who hadn't spoken to her in a decade. Then came Ruth, a widow in her 80s who had been evicted from her daughter's home after refusing to sign over her savings. One by one, they came, women with tired eyes and wounded hearts, each carrying a different story but the same ache of betrayal. Lucille welcomed them all. She turned the guest room into a cozy bedroom, converted Henry's old office into a shared library, and planted new jasmine by the porch. Meals were cooked together, stories shared late into the night over tea. Laughter, hesitant at first, began to echo through the halls again. The house that had once suffocated her now breathed deeply, full of life and resilience. News of the House of the Brave spread beyond Maplewood Lane. A local reporter from the Lancaster Herald came by one afternoon, notebook in hand. She was young and earnest, full of questions about Lucille's past, about Henry, about the betrayal that had started it all. Lucille answered politely, but she stopped the reporter when the conversation turned toward revenge. "This isn't a revenge story," Lucille said, her voice steady but gentle. "It's a story about memory, about dignity, about what happens when we refuse to be erased." The reporter looked up from her notes. "And love?" she asked. Lucille smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the window where Evelyn and Ruth were laughing as they hung laundry in the late afternoon sun. "Love," she said softly, "should never hurt, not even when it comes from your child." The article ran a week later under the headline "A House That Refused to Break." Letters and donations began arriving from across the state, women offering support, families asking how they could help, volunteers wanting to contribute. But the most meaningful messages were the quiet ones, handwritten notes from women who had never spoken of their pain until now. Lucille read every one, and with each letter, with each woman who walked through her door, she felt the weight of her past shift a little more into purpose. The house had once been a prison built of betrayal. Now it was a sanctuary, not just for her, but for anyone who needed a place to start again. A year slipped by quietly, and with it came Lucille's 71st birthday. The seasons had turned full circle since the day Henry tried to erase her, and the house, once a monument to betrayal, had become something she could never have imagined. The House of the Brave was thriving. Women came and went, some staying for weeks, others for months, but all of them left stronger than when they arrived. They planted flowers in the garden, repainted the walls, and filled the rooms with stories and laughter. What had once been a lonely old house now pulsed with the heartbeat of resilience. But that year brought sorrow too. Martha Campbell, Lucille's dearest friend and the woman who had slipped her that first lifeline of a phone, passed away peacefully in her sleep. Lucille found herself standing at Martha's graveside under a soft spring drizzle, holding a letter Martha had left for her. In her unmistakable looping handwriting, it read, "Never let them forget that even an old woman can change her fate." Lucille folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket, carrying it home like a compass. Life moved forward. Lucille continued to welcome new residents, guiding them with a steady hand and a heart that had learned how to heal. Some evenings, when the house had gone quiet and the hallways were lit only by the soft glow of lamplight, she swore she could hear footsteps outside her door. Slow, hesitant, familiar. She never opened it to check. Deep down, she knew they belonged to Henry. He never knocked, never spoke, never tried to come inside. But the footsteps always paused by her door, as if to say he was still there, still watching, still hoping she was all right. On the morning of her 71st birthday, Lucille awoke to the smell of cinnamon and sugar. In the kitchen, the women had gathered around a cake they'd baked together, its imperfect frosting glowing in the sunlight. Beside, it was a handmade card, signed by every woman who had passed through the house that year. In careful script, the message read, "Thank you for giving us hope." Lucille's throat tightened as she read the words. Hope. It was such a small thing, yet it was everything. It was what had carried her through the worst nights, what had built this home from ashes, what now bound all these women together. That night, after the laughter and the toasts had faded into the hush of evening, Lucille sat by the fire with her journal open on her lap. She stared at the blank page for a long time before writing a single line. A mother can lose everything, but never the strength to rise again. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light across the room. Lucille closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet, speaking to the man who had once built this house with his hands and his heart. "Now you can rest, Samuel," she murmured. "The house is full again, not with money but with life." Outside, the jasmine stirred gently in the night breeze, and for the first time in decades, Lucille felt that every root she had planted, in this soil, in this house, in herself, had survived the storm.